Now, we are recording. This is the CREO webinar entitled Reproduction in the Pond. In the next 25 minutes or so, we're going to discuss one of the most important evolutionary innovations in the history of animal life on this planet. But in order to discuss that, we have to put the conversation and the ideas arising from that conversation in appropriate context. What do we mean by reproduction in the pond? How did life move from a watery environment to a dry land environment and evolutionarily drag along with it, in that intrinsic biological sense, the ability to make copies of itself? Because that, after all, is what reproduction is. Life began in water. Water is life's medium. It's what we've talked about in CREO, about the role of water, in particular, how it is the bridge between the non-living and the living worlds. Reproduction in the pond, then, is simply taking that idea of the origin of life in water and running with it a little bit. Now, an animal bridge between the world of water and the world of land is, of course, the amphibians. Amphibians live in both worlds. Like all life forms, they reproduce in a watery surrounding. Even organisms that live on dry land, organisms like ourselves, require a watery medium for reproduction to take place. What amphibians did is they took that lifestyle, which all life had prior to the Paleozoic, from the marine system to the terrestrial system, the movement from sea onto land. Amphibians did this by increasing their mobility. Amphibians have a fish-like body intrinsically. Looking at a tadpole, looking at a salamander or an axolotl, other amphibians, makes you think, oh, something between a fish and a land animal. Bones supporting gills here, and a typical four-limbed tetrapod skeleton, but otherwise quite fish-like head, and here modified fins like these that go into legs. Now, all of these bones, of course, are present in the lobe-finned fishes and certain lungfishes, fishes that are able to gulp air and live on land long enough to hop from one body of water to another. Amphibians are different from fish, not only because their ability to breathe air, but they have appendages, legs, that were well muscled, supported by the axial here and the peripheral here skeleton. And their pectoral girdle moved back from the head to permit more head movement. And you can see that here, that they're actually neck bones. Besides increased mobility of the amphibians, lungs became further developed. So it wasn't just gulping air anymore. And skin was well vascularized so that gas exchange could take place between the atmosphere which by Paleozoic time was rich enough in oxygen to allow for diffusion of air through wet skin to blood vessels. That's another site of gas exchange. Amphibians also had a more developed, and they continue to have, because there are amphibians around now, of course, a better developed circulatory system than their fish predecessors. They had a 3-chambered heart, allowing more pressure to the peripheral arteries, leading to the appendages, different parts of the body, than that of the 2-chambered heart of the fish. An important evolutionary development. This made it possible for these organisms to go onto land and open a new ecological niche for all animals. Amphibians. Features that illustrate their contemporary primitive nature and transitional form show that they're not truly terrestrial animals. Evolutionary theory allows us to understand this. Amphibians are ectothermic. Their body temperature is regulated in no other way except from that of the temperature of their environment. It's determined by and varies with external temperature. They can become very sluggish when temperatures are low. And when it gets so cold that it threatens body tissues with ice development, they either must hibernate, migrate, or die. Amphibian skin, because of this gas exchange that I mentioned, must be kept thin and moist. Consequently, they lose a lot of water through their skin. And for most amphibians, not all, toads would be a great example of this, but most amphibians must be kept continuously moist. Otherwise, they dry out and this would be lethal to them. What is clear is that reproduction of all amphibians is external, and they must do this reproduction in water. Fertilization without a covering of water would mean that the eggs would dry up. Amphibians also have a larval stage that is aquatic and in many ways more closely resembling that of a fish lifestyle than any terrestrial animal. So if anybody challenges you in evolutionary theory about the existence of transition forms, show them a frog, show them a salamander, show them any amphibian. And here is an example of something that inhabits a terrestrial ecological niche and has successfully done so since the Paleozoic. This is where things get, of course, very interesting, because the area that I have highlighted here on this cladogram, this evolutionary tree, shows that an innovation occurred in the Paleozoic, towards the end of the Paleozoic, by amphibians in the emergence of the reptiles. Reptiles look, in a general sense, kind of primitive. They have a sort of, and some of them anyway, an amphibian-like body plan. You might see that in this baby alligator here. Again, a kind of a triangular shaped head, but they have fundamental differences that are a reflection of the adaptations that had to take place in the Paleozoic in order to make reptiles possible. And these adaptations were driven mostly by the climate change that occurred in the Paleozoic with the rise of Pangaea. When the supercontinent Pangaea assembled so that most, but not all, but most land was in one supercontinent, it meant that there were vast inland areas away from the sea that were dry. This is not a good environment for amphibians, obviously. Reptiles, on the other hand, emerged out of a group of amphibians, the ancestral amniotes here, the bottom of this figure. That, just a moment, here we are back again. The ancestral amniotes, these are the egg-laying ancestors of the synapsids, which lead to the therapsids and the mammals, the anapsids, which lead to an extinct group here, as well as a small branch that became the turtles and other turtle-like organisms, and the diapsids, for which birds and reptiles and so forth are all a part. The ancestral amniote found a way to lay eggs on land and to do this after internal fertilization. Reptiles. Reptiles are different from amphibians. The most obvious change from amphibian to reptile is the position of the legs, rather than out to the side in a fish-like way, but more directly underneath the animal to push up against gravity, to push up against the surface. This provided more support than amphibian legs. Of course, the legs become more robust and muscularized, and you have more robust development of bones. The jaws also became better adapted, to biting and tearing as opposed to amphibians. The body becomes covered with scales. This is a mechanism to mitigate water loss. It provides protection against predators, but it also provides protection of the body against drying out. This is a clear innovation from the environmental effects of the assembly of Pangaea. Reptiles, they do not respire through their skin, but through internally protected and moistened lungs. So the lungs continue to develop so that through the nostril or the glottis region and the trachea, leading to lungs behind the ribs here. Of course, amphibians have simple lungs. Reptiles are so successful because they can breathe air all the time. They don't have to keep their skin moist. The lung tissue is very convoluted, so it has an enormous surface area that is thin and has a thin membrane and is kept moist so that air can diffuse through the membrane and oxygenate the blood. The paired limbs of the amphibians, as I mentioned, were repositioned more under the body and usually have 5 toes in reptiles and are variously adapted for climbing, running, swimming, in the case of birds, flying, and they're altogether absent in the snakes, which followed another evolutionary path that didn't require them to have limbs. Except for the crocodiles, reptiles still have a 3 chambered heart. But the blood for the lungs is not mixed with deoxygenated blood. So they're separated. It's unclear if dinosaurs had a like a 4-chambered heart, and that is an area of ongoing research. Fish are just much simpler in this respect. They have a simple 2-chambered loop where blood is pumped to the gills for gas exchange and is very inefficient for the supply of oxygen to the heart and to the blood itself. And this circulatory system can be reversed in some cases in some fish. Amphibians have 2 separate loops in their circulatory system. Unfortunately for amphibians anyway, it is still quite inefficient because oxygen-poor blood continues to get mixed with oxygen-rich blood by going into the small, less developed heart. Reptiles, the blood may mix, but there is a partial barrier, and certainly in the case of the crocodiles, to prevent mixing of the oxygen-poor and oxygen-rich blood. Mammals have 4-chambered hearts. The heart is supplied with oxygen by its own circulatory system. So as you see, it's well divided here. Oxygen-poor, rich blood is brought to the lungs, gets oxygenated, and here, and then is pumped to the body, and then oxygen-poor blood from the body goes in here, is then sent to the lungs. There's no mixing of the two within the heart. This is a beautiful key line of evidence, in addition to everything else that I've mentioned about reptiles and their Paleozoic lifestyle and the result of them populating these vast inland regions of Pangaea. The waste of reptiles is uric acid, unlike dilute water that is wasted urine in the amphibians. So birds and other reptiles, they excrete their waste mostly as uric acid and solids. And so it's a water-saving measure that is left over from their original dry lifestyle. The brains of reptiles also show development because as the body becomes more developed, there is more in the nervous system that needs control. And consequently, the first cerebral cortex of the vertebrates appears in the reptiles. Here in an example from the human brain, on the human brain here, in the forepart of the brain, for the most part, devoted to what we call higher learning, higher ideas, language, concepts, artistic vision. Reptilian brain here, artistic visions, but our reptilian brain here in the back is instinct, dominance, survival. Eyes are not very far from this. So eyesight tends to be in the hind brain here, along with feelings and emotions in the so-called mammalian brain part. Reptiles are still ectothermic, so they have to live in favorable climates during cold periods or hibernate. Now, birds and dinosaurs, we now know, regulate their own body temperatures. And the most successful aspect, however, besides all what I've already mentioned about reptiles, was in their reproduction. Because reproduction is the mechanism, the feedstock, as it were, of evolutionary change in biology. Fertilization did not take place externally. as with amphibians and fish and everything else that lives in the marine realm. Fertilization is internal. Therefore, the gametes are, or the eggs are not, the fertilized eggs are not subject to drying out. Zygotes and young embryos, instead of being covered in a jelly-like, fish-like egg of amphibians, instead had or have a tough water-resistant leathery or calcareous shell. The pond where life began and life remained in the watery realm until the Paleozoic, where all reproduction ultimately takes place, was now transferred into an egg that could be laid on land instead of water. So the pond is brought as an egg to the land. This greatly enhances terrestrial survival. The egg, of course, has many components. Here's the shell, as I mentioned, could be calcareous or leathery, that surrounds various extraembryonic membranes. Here's the embryo in the center that is fed here by the yolk, and around it are various other structures that you can see are labeled here. This environment that's around it, that encapsulates the embryo, is a microcosm of the pond in which amphibians and fish and everything else that lives in water all the time must reproduce. The first tetrapods, four-legged animals, not like insects, but animals, were amphibians. They could live on land, but they need to return to water to breed. And the break with the water came with the amniotes, the egg layers on land in the early Carboniferous, in the Paleozoic. And this shelled egg allowed them to inhabit dry habitats. They have scaly waterproof skins and other abilities, as I've mentioned, to preserve water. This development of the amniotes created then an evolutionary explosion in the diversity of reptiles, then going into different organisms like mammal-like reptiles and turtles and dinosaurs and birds, as shown here. And these are the reptiles that we are familiar with today. They are the successful group, really, that dominated the Mesozoic, the middle time of Earth history. Mammals arose from a group of amniotes, the synapsids. Mammals originally had four major branches: the monotremes, the multituberculates, the marsupials, and the eutherians. The multituberculata or multituberculates, they're extinct now. We think that they were kind of marsupial-like. Unfortunately, there are no living examples, but there are two species and one genus of egg-laying mammals, the monotremes, which we will talk about now. So these are the beautiful, hairy, milk-producing, warm-blooded animals you've seen all your life, the mammals. We are mammals. We number 8 billion individuals. We're amongst the most successful ones, arguably the most successful of all mammals. We are placental mammals, the eutherians. Here's an example of this monkey. Placental mammals are one of the three major groups, as I mentioned, of living mammals. The marsupials or Metatheria. These are all the pouched animals, such as kangaroos, Tasmanian devils, possums, etc. The third group, here's platypus, are quite strange. They are warm-blooded. They have hair. They produce milk. So for all intents and purposes, they're mammals, but they lay eggs and they don't give live birth like marsupials or placental mammals. And the multituberculata, just to repeat, they were once widespread, very successful, but they're entirely extinct now. Let's talk a little bit about the monotremes. Not many people know much about these things. You may have heard of the echidna, or the spiny anteater. Here lives in Australia, for instance, and in parts of Papua New Guinea. The duck-billed platypus. They're not very diverse. There's hardly any fossil record of these things. They appear to have been Gondwana land flora, so the southern great continent of Pangaea, which sort of broke apart into two big pieces. They're very primitive because, like reptiles and birds, they lay eggs. Here are examples of some of their eggs. I mean, the eggs are small, about thumbnail size. They're quite delicate creatures, and they're also highly derived. They have high snouts or beaks. Adult monotremes have no teeth. They have a single bone in their lower jaw, nevertheless, 3 inner ear bones, high metabolic rates. They have to eat a lot of food. So they just are transition mammals. Marsupials are more familiar, like, of course, the kangaroos. Here's the thylacine, the so-called Tasmanian tiger, which went extinct in the 1920s. There are attempts now to de-extinct this creature by cloning. We shall see. They give live birth like placental mammals and unlike monotremes. Oh, by the way, monotreme means one whole. So a monotreme poos and pees and lays an egg out of the same hole. So in that way, they also resemble birds and reptiles. Marsupials, on the other hand, have a very short gestation time, so much shorter than that of placental mammals. So the embryo is basically birthed in a very premature state. And it climbs from the mother's birth canal to the nipples near a pouch, depending on the species. And placental mammals use the mother's blood supply. They have longer gestation times than marsupial mammals. So marsupial mammals have this peculiar reproduction, which means that their embryo, which is very, very delicate, can easily be damaged. The only naturally occurring marsupial in North America is the possum, and they look like giant rats because they are covered in hair and have a rat-like tail. They were once very common throughout Gondwana during the Mesozoic, but what happened was when Gondwana continents, which had been separated from the northern Laurasian continent, reconnected, placental mammals invaded and outcompeted marsupials, which is something, by the way, that appears to be happening today in parts of, for example, Australia. Placental mammals, the mammal group that we're a part of, have 4,000 described species. Most of these are rats and bats, rodents, rodent-like animals. They're quite diverse. Everything from whales to elephants, shrews, armadillos, dogs, cats, humans, all of us are placentals. They bear live young, like marsupials, but these are nourished before birth in the uterus, a true uterine structure through a specialized organ called a placenta, which is attached to the uterine wall. This is another very interesting link to evolutionary theory, because the placenta, which is shown here in this diagram on the right, is derived from the same membranes that surround embryos in amniotic eggs of reptiles, birds, and monotreme mammals. And if you just compare a diagram of an amniotic egg, where the embryo would be here, and the amniotic fluid in the amnion, and the yolk sac here, you're seeing a very similar structure, fundamental evolutionary structure recapitulated, where reptiles brought the pond to land encapsulated into an egg. Mammals have the pond in the body. So internal fertilization, and the egg remains there in a watery realm. So the body is the vessel of reproduction. The diversity of mammals is such and possible because reproduction in the pond is facilitated by the pond being the body. That's the end of our webinar for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and please visit creo.space for more information, which you'll see in the liner notes to this presentation. Bye-bye.